Welcome everyone, it's Professor Stuckler and we've got a fantastic session lined up for you. We're continuing with our gift method, the method that's going to help you avoid some of the most common mistakes students make when preparing their research proposals. Today we've got a great live session. Thanks for a submission from one of our members of the group, Samantha, who's graciously been willing to share and put herself out there so that we can work collectively to improve her proposal. I think you're going to like it a lot. And any of you who are struggling with proposals, whether that's for a grant, whether that's for your PhD, whether it's even for a fellowship, these are the things, the essential ingredients you need to master. And it's a skill that's so important to you as an academic and beyond as you reach the level where I'm at, where you're trying to constantly fight to get money to support your team, or even at the very beginning to have a smooth, easy ride on your project. It all starts from getting that proposal right. So we're going to roll up our sleeves, dive in. I'm going to do a brief recap of the gift method, picking back up on last week for those of you who weren't with us. And as always, before we dive in, I'd like to welcome our new members. It's a really fantastic opportunity for those of you just joining Fast Track Grad. We have a ton of valuable training and support, and I specifically created this group for grads who really felt like they weren't getting the support, mentorship, and guidance they need. It's a support that I wish I would have had as a grad. As a first-generation grad student, I feel like I made a lot of mistakes, was banging my head against the wall. At one point, I was on the verge of flunking out, even for this very step, because I couldn't get my proposal right, and I was going in circles. And I don't want you to have that experience I did. I don't want you to have that suffering. I want you to have a straight line, smooth, steady progress where you can feel good and confident because the research is already difficult enough for you to do. So here I'm going to lift the lid and show you the secrets, the things that I've been passing on kind of in the ivory tower to my students at Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge over the years. And I make these completely open, publicly available to you. So I do also want to announce, last week I announced we had 2 slots. One of those has gone. We've got 1 slot I'm looking to fill really quickly for students who want to work intensively and closely together and take advantage of a really powerful community of practice. Our students are getting great results. We just had 3 revise and resubmits this week. Another paper got published. Another student got a really prestigious fellowship. So really proud of our community and the great work everybody's doing. And if you are getting value out of our Facebook group, do let other people know. It helps us to serve more grads. So with that, I am going to share the screen and dive straight in. By the way, all of you are welcome to submit your papers. This is kind of your time together. So if there's things you're struggling with or working on, I try to pick some of the best ones I think everybody's going to get the most value out of, but I respond to all the inquiries. So do email me, DM me, get in touch with my assistant, Christine, and we'll go from there. Okay, the gift method. All right, some of you guys will remember what this stands for. I'm going to go through each in turn, and this is going to cover kind of the essential. This is not an exhaustive method, but this is kind of the bare minimum that you have to get right for your proposal to be on point. And the very first thing, and probably the most important thing, is you need to identify the gap. You need to have crystal clear clarity on what is missing from past studies, what is weak about past literature, and how you're going to propose to fill that gap. So the very first thing you need to articulate in your proposal before you even start writing up, right? Don't start writing up until you know what the big gap is that you're trying to address. And I'm going to repeat that. You have to know what the gap is. You have to be able to explain to me in an elevator in 30 seconds, this is the gap. And if you can't tell your mother or your grandmother or your best friend, your partner, anybody what that gap is, you're not ready to start writing your proposal. You need to do more digging and more legwork to get to that point. Okay, so clarity about the gap. Second thing you need to have clarity on is what your idea is. What is your innovation? So, okay, I've kind of laid out, I see this gap. I see this area that needs to be addressed. How am I going to do that? How am I going to go where others have not gone? What am I going to do different from what others have done to address that gap, this burning problem in our field that it really needs to be addressed but hasn't been yet? And you need to have clarity about your idea. If you don't have that clarity, you have no business writing up yet. You need to know exactly what it is you want to do and have a plan. Because really the process of writing is just kind of translating that plan into a clean, coherent, accessible way that others can understand and follow and be convinced by. And in so doing that, one of the things you really need to demonstrate about your plan is you need to convince the people reading this that this is feasible. Often I'm applying for grants where there's a lot of money at stake. They're not just going to throw 2 million to just anybody. It needs to be a really big question, big gap. You need to have a good idea that you can do something really innovative, really exciting that's going to break new ground. And I need to prove I can actually do it. That they're gonna. So you need to convince people who are reading your proposal that, hey, you're not going to be a student who's going to be in the 7th year because you're going on forever because your idea doesn't make any sense and you feasible. It might be brilliant, but you can't actually execute it. So that feasibility is really fundamental, and there's some ways to kind of check to make sure that that's on point. We're going to look at that as well. And related to that, you need to have a coherent timeline that you can demonstrate that you have stepped back and looked at. Hey, I've got a roadmap, I've got a plan, how I'm going to break each chunk, and I'll be able to finish this thing. And that's really fundamental. So I really want to see all of your proposals at least have a timeline. Sometimes the proposal might not actually include a section for the timeline, or you might not have space. That's okay. You want to have that clarity for yourself anyway going in. So with this, I'm going to turn over, and if you guys have any questions about this, do let me know. I want you to think about how you can apply this to your own work. Think about your own research. Do you have clarity about any research project you're doing? Do you have clarity about the gap and what your idea is to plug that gap? These things are going to come back in the introduction of your research papers. And it's one thing that's great about a research proposal. You do a good research proposal, that's not work lost. That's the literature review, the background, the work you've done, that's going to pay off later. It's going to pay off through the clarity in developing a good research plan. It's going to pay off in terms of your paper having a strong introduction, because these are all essential ingredients for the introduction. Okay, I'm going to take off this share and I'm going to pull up the submission that we had this week that I'm really excited to share with you. And some students have been voiced a little bit of concerns about confidentiality. They don't want someone to rip off their work. This is really an open access supportive community. It's never happened before, so I would be rather really dismayed and upset if I heard about that happening. But also, one of the great things about kind of going out there is everybody knows this is yours. It's kind of planting a flag for the whole world to say, hey, this is yours. So again, but I just wanted to put that flag out there. It's never happened, and I really hope it doesn't. We're all ethical researchers in this group, and all wanting to do our best. Okay, going to share the screen with you and show you the proposal. And the very first thing we're going to do as we look at this proposal for a PhD dissertation is we're going to look for these gift elements. And we're going to see the extent to which they're expressed in this proposal. And we're going to see kind of score them and grade them on and how well those bases have been covered. We're going to also kind of take a macro view and look structurally at this proposal. I'm going to kind of highlight some points of weaknesses, some points of strength, and things we can improve in each of these areas. You're going to be looking at this for the first time like me, and I think that's really helpful because you're going to get to see, too, how somebody on the other side is looking at your proposal. Often when somebody's looking at your proposal, they're looking at it very quickly, and they need to be able to spot these elements. And they often make a very quick judgment, is this good or bad? And then kind of marshal evidence to justify their impression of it. So I'm going to go ahead and share, and we'll get an overview of this together. Okay. So I'm going to zoom in so everybody can see quite well. And I can see there's some track changes on here. I'm intentionally looking at this for the first time with you, so we're all looking at it fresh. Okay, so we've kind of got a title: Do Black Americans' perceptions of mental health providers' openness to spirituality impact Black Americans' mental health help-seeking attitudes? Okay, that's already quite a mouthful. I'm going to try to simplify this a little bit. I think we can do that. And let's just take a macro look at the structure. We've got aims. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just so we can see kind of how the structure is coming out. Okay, we got aims, and then it looks like specific aims, which is a little bit quirky. Now, sometimes departments will have a different way to structure things, but usually you might have background, and you kind of start broad, and then you narrow to the specific aims. So structurally, this is a little quirky to put the specific aims, but I'm going to assume that it's been done that way just because that was requested by the department. But this would be a little quirky, just to say usually get into the specific aims after you've set up the background. You want things to be linear to make it easy on your reviewers. So we'll take a look at that. It's a little strange to go specific aim and then go back to the background. Background significance. So we have a section on help-seeking attitudes and then theoretical frameworks of health-seeking. So I do like that this proposal has put in place these subsection headings. I'm reading this out because I do know it can be a little hard to see. There you can see theoretical frameworks of health-seeking. But I'm just taking this macro bird's eye view to see structurally, does this outline make sense? And this is a little weird. This is a little strange that help-seeking attitudes is just a few paragraphs and then goes into these frameworks. So I want to connect these to the bigger research questions, and that's not really connected. So let's keep going. Incongruent worldviews. So yeah, I see some structural things that are a little bit hard here. So again, I'm just trying to get a macro overview of this paper in this proposal at the moment. Keep going. Then we have spiritual humility is in here. And then finally, only on page 25 do we get to the present study. So again, you got to follow up what's going on with your department, but this is quite for a dissertation proposal. I'd want to kind of clarify this a little bit. This often for a proposal, this is quite late getting to the present study. I'd want to get to the present study faster. And then this is good. We've described methods, participants. This is all going to be part of feasibility. We'll come back to that, and we'll look at this closely. What's going on here? The analysis plan for the analysis. That's good. I like these subsections. I like that there's a power analysis in here. We'll talk about that. If you don't know what a power analysis is, don't worry. We will talk about that as well. And a figure. Here's a proposed model. Okay, let's take a quick look at this proposed model. Okay, psychological distress. And so I like that the students try to draw a causal logic model. We're going to come back and look at that, although I see some things that worry me a little bit about it. Let's go down to the end. That looks like that's okay. And then here's some survey questions. So I want to take a look at that too. Okay, let's first go and look for the gap. So let's scan. I'm just scanning quickly and looking for where the gap is talked about. So gap. Okay, spirituality is an important dimension of health. It's often not given importance. Okay, so I already spot a problem here. I don't see... this gap is not very well laid out. So that's a huge problem. To explore, and that gap is already creating problems I can see with the idea. So, right, the overarching goal of the study is to explore the impact of psychological distress and humility on help seeking for mental health care. I think one of the challenges here is that the gap is not laid out very clearly, and that's making the idea not connect very well to that gap. So there's different ways of framing the gap that you can draw on. So one way of framing the gap is to say that there just isn't enough research on the role that spiritual humility plays in health-seeking behavior, in this case. But it's really, really unclear what the gap is. So that's critical. I have some ideas on this gap. I want to come back to it. I just want to look and make sure maybe that gap is covered a little bit elsewhere. So I'm going to scroll down for a second. Builds on the work. So talking about African American populations having some problems, but taken together, these models show why. So this is not really clear. Again, these models show further research is needed, but I don't understand why. So this is saying the same thing. And let's see, maybe one of their co-authors saying nothing that you describe suggests the link is not consistent. Says it strongly suggests. In fact, you've got a colleague here who's saying the same thing that I'm saying, that the gap has not been effectively, this gap is not identified. So this is a problem. This is a major point of weakness at the moment, and that is creating a weakness. If you don't have the gap right, you have no chance of getting the idea quite right. So now you're trying to say you're looking here at Black Americans' mental health help-seeking attitudes. What drives help-seeking attitudes? Um, so I'm confused about the causal logic of your study and the idea of what is the gap and your idea to fill that gap. Now, one thing that I saw you tried to do here, which was helpful, and I always like this, especially if you're going to be doing some kind of quantitative work, is, let me find that DAG. This here is connect um, what exposure or intervention or factor you're looking at, independent variable, there's different ways of describing this, to what the outcome is. And here your outcome is mental health, help-seeking attitudes. And this is not entirely clear. You've kind of set this up that clinician, spiritual humility, I think you're wanting here modifies the relationship between stress. So if somebody's in distress and they think their clinician has more spiritual humility, they're more likely to seek help. But I have some questions about the causal logic here, because firstly, do they know who their clinician is at this point by the time they're seeking help? I thought you said one of the barriers is they're not seeking help at all. So how do they know if their clinicians have spiritual humility? This is a little bit confusing. So maybe you're saying this is only, is this perceptions about their clinician or perceptions about clinicians as a whole? This is a little bit unclear. So this I want to tighten up. So I think what you need to make your argument, you need to do a few things. And I'm just going to write this up here in some track changes and just kind of get your logic. So your introduction needs to make the argument that that you have very low, you have high disorders or mental health problems, but low utilization, and say that very clearly. You're kind of getting that here, but then you kind of throw in spirituality and spiritual coping, and you haven't really cooked this enough. So remember, use also our peer system. Each paragraph makes one point that's going to help you. So you have high mental health problems but low utilization, and that this is kind of the context for your debate. You're trying to understand why is utilization so low. And maybe people have said there's cultural barriers, etc., all sorts of things. Maybe there's perceived racism. You need to say kind of what you think, what the background literature is saying. What are other people saying? Why do they have such low utilization for the health problems? Maybe they're unaware of the problem. Maybe is this the same for men and for women? We know women are more likely to seek care. Men are less likely. Is this about stigma of mental health? There's other things. So you need to show you you're also familiar with that literature. And then you want to say here this role about perceived spirituality, and I don't fully understand the hypothesis, and you've got to explain this a bit more. Do you think that this applies to people? What if these Black Americans are not religious at all? Is this going to be relevant to them? That's something you've got to think about. Or is this only for people who are already religious? They then care about the religiosity of their care providers. You really have to be kind of precise and detailed in making the case that you've identified a gap. So you need to say maybe then spirituality tends to be neglected, and there are very few studies, or that the studies are of low quality, or there's something deficient about the work on spirituality. Maybe spirituality, all the studies have focused on how people's religious beliefs affect whether they go seek care, but they haven't looked at how people's perceptions about the spirituality of their clinicians makes care seem more accessible to them. This is really unclear. So there's a split here between the spirituality of the patient and the provider, and that needs to be, you need to be really clear about what that gap is. I think you're saying about the provider, so maybe you want to say lots of studies on religiosity about the patients, but not about the providers, and the two meeting together. Difficult to see the writing. Thanks for letting me know. Let me know if Can you see the writing now? I'm trying to speak through it to you as we go through it, as I'm looking at this live. So thanks for letting me know. I was having a quick scan myself for the first time to really, spot what's going on with the gap and the idea of this paper. And I think that then that gets you into say, so your research question, your aim needs to be very tight to a hypothesis. Say, I would make it, I think hypothesis testing will fit for your department and where it's at. And you've kind of already said this. Do their do their perceptions, does greater openness to spirituality impact? I would actually, you actually have a direction in this hypothesis. I always like having a direction. It just makes things cleaner and simple. I think you're saying if when these providers are more open, that they're more likely to seek help. So, and you're kind of drawing this other split of perceptions rather than reality. That's another thing. And I don't know if you're coming back in their research. Are you just going to look at what they perceive? Or are you going to look at? Are you actually going to go and look at the providers themselves? Because what if I perceive my provider to be open, but they're actually not? Is that okay? There's different layers to your research question here, but I would already reframe this to make it simple for yourself. Perceptions of and again, there's the other question that you need to sort out is this their care providers? Because I thought they weren't seeking care, so how do they already have a care provider? That's really unclear. So some of these things are hard for me to answer. They're only things that you can answer. So I'm going to put these points to clarify. Clarify, is this their provider? Do they already have one? That's going to shape the way you set up your study. And you need to also clarify, what research on spirituality and this concept you wanted to introduce of spiritual humility, what of this has been done before on patients help seeking behavior. So I think it'll be really important. There's a ton of research on this utilization of mental health being so low. And you need to talk, you're saying specifically you think it's worse for Black Americans. So the other thing you need to point out is some data and evidence that this is much worse for Black Americans. I don't see any data to really prove that. I believe that's true, but you still need to show it to us. So these are definitely the things you need to tighten up. So this gap, bring the gap into focus, and by getting that gap, I think you're going to fix your idea, and that's going to give you clarity. Let's turn to looking at feasibility. And I'm going to skip all the background and go straight to your project, because this is really going to be the crux of what they're going to look for you to be able to go ahead. So let's come down here. I'm just going quickly. Sorry, I hope I'm not trying to make you dizzy. Go to the methods. Here we go. And see, and often you're slipping into a little bit of exploratory. So here you're saying it could be a barrier or a facilitator. I mean, I think you might want to unpack that a bit more and try to say that maybe that just depends on the religious congruence between the patient and the provider. Maybe, right, the patient's a Christian, the provider is Hindu, and maybe that actually creates a barrier. Don't know, but something to look at. Okay, so you're going to use data from a larger study. What larger study? So we need to specify what that larger study is. Who's doing that larger study? So this worries me already, because then your success depends on the success of this larger study. Has that larger study been completed? Are they collecting the data? Are you going to collect the data? So that's not clear to me. So exactly, this is important. You're saying they're going to participate whether or not they've engaged in therapy in the past. So we don't know if they have a mental health provider. So on what basis are they setting up perceptions of these clinicians? That's going to be very different for people who have had some experience with the mental health system and those who have not. I also want to know if you're using, so I want to know if you're using standard scales and measures to engage, or are you producing new ones yourself? So it looks like you're going to do a survey. And again, you're writing this often in passive voice, which makes it harder to write and harder to follow I strongly recommend you shift to active voice. If you don't know what I mean by active voice, let me know and we'll connect you to a good training on that. But who's directing participants to Qualtrics? And this is the problem sometimes when you're not an active voice. It creates a lack of clarity. So participants will be directed to participate. This is a little quirky. They're not participants yet. Anyway. But yeah, so check that. That's some things. It's a little unclear. It's not clear what your role is here. What are you going to do, and what's this larger study? So this is something that really needs to be clarified. What are you actually doing, and what is the role of the larger study? I mean, is that larger study going to do all this, and you're just going to get the data and analyze it? So that's kind of important. So here's a demographic questionnaire. Again, it's not clear to me that you're doing this here. So, okay, you've got so it looks like you've drawn on an already established off-plate demographic questionnaire. That's good. Spirituality measures. This is obviously very critical for your research. And I want to know that these are questions that are already validated. So where did you get this question? And you're saying here you're making a cutoff for eligibility. Why? So you're only so this is important. So you're only including, and this was not clear in the proposal. So you're only including them, only including if they have, if spirituality is important to the patient. I feel like if you do that, you're actually missing a big part of the equation. So think if you really want to do that, but. Yeah, you also need to explain how's that going to affect your sample size and your numbers, because that could cut things in half, depending on what the prevalence of spirituality is in your group. This is good. It looks like you're using pre-existing scale. It's like you're using pre-existing help-seeking attitude scale, so that's nice. I like that. You might just want to say, add some citations, show that it was previously validated. That's good. Cultural humility scale. That's good. I'm not sure what you're using this for. And you say this will be used to examine spiritual humility as a moderator and the relationship between spiritual well-being and wait, hang on. This is something else that's completely come out of nowhere. This logic, you're saying you're looking at spiritual well-being drives mental health, and now you're saying somewhere sitting on here, cultural humility is modifying this relationship. So I don't see where that came from. It's not in your DAG, and it's different from the whole introduction you've set up. So this kind of comes out of nowhere. So you need to set that up. You need to foreground that. So it's good you're showing that it's a validated measure, so that's good. But this is also okay. I think this is really quite important to where you might even want to split your sample. This previous therapy experience, I mean, I think these two groups are fundamentally quite different in what barriers they may face. So you may want to think about actually stratifying this depending on your numbers. Then in your analysis plan, a positive relation between psychological distress and engagement and this. This is, again, confusing. You've put three things. This is a little bit hard to follow. So you think more psychological distress is going to be increasing help-seeking attitudes, and this isn't stated really clearly at all. And it looks like your colleagues here is saying, I'm not sure why this would be hypothesized. I agree. I don't really, you haven't set that up. So I think you're running into a lot of trouble because you started, it looks like you started writing, you did a ton of writing, but before you had the clarity that you need to really succeed. And then let me come back in again, and here we've got, so the problem is you're having trouble convincing us if this is feasible. And the other problem I'm having of the feasibility here is I don't see anything about the numbers kind of you're expecting to see. What kind of sample sizes are you expecting here? Do you have enough numbers? So, and then that comes to this power analysis. So power analysis, don't want to get into details, but helps you know can you, if you have too small a sample size, you could get, you could do statistical tests and find no relationship. No relationship just because you've got a small sample size and you have a lot of noise. The world's pretty noisy, and you can't really detect a signal. You can't hear it because there's so much noise. As your sample size gets bigger, it gets easier to detect a real finding if it actually exists in the world. So power analysis helps you detect that your sample's big enough. And so this isn't really quite convincing. I mean, this is also very small numbers of participants. So I think this hasn't been done quite correctly. We can link you up with some ways to do a power calculation, but this looks very, very small. You're trying to test interactions. So it's even worse. Small effect size. This looks too small just on eyeball. I haven't run the numbers, but I'd like to know how many numbers, how big a sample size you're expecting. I also want to know, again, what's completely missing is the timeline. If you're sitting here completely depending on this larger study, I'm going back up to this point here, you're depending on this larger study. Well, when is that larger study? What's the date of that study? When is that supposed to be completed? When are you going to have data in your hands to be able to analyze it? Because if you're sitting around waiting for years, that's not very good. I also want to understand, why did you choose these data? You haven't really justified these data as opposed to other data that exist. Are there no data sets that exist that enable you to test this? That goes all the way back up to our gap. Maybe there's no data set that you've been able to link, and nobody's been able to look at this before, and that's motivated you to connect new data. And so this goes back up here. How does the lack of data fit into the gap? Have others not been able to test this causal pathway because they lacked data to populate? That's really important. So listen, I'm really thankful that you shared this with us. And again, I think the original thing that's creating problems here is the gap. I would, if you can, I would move these specific aims. I would switch your order a little bit. If this is a template you need to follow, that's fine. Then leave it, but definitely restructure this introduction to lay out the gap better. And remember, each paragraph makes one point. Make your aims and hypotheses more clearly laid out. And I would go through especially and be much clearer about the larger study, how yours fits in, to really convince on the feasibility that you can actually do this. And it looks like your co-author or supervisor or colleague has been touching on very similar kinds of points. Okay, with that, I would just want to open up to those of you who've been watching along as well. If you find this helpful, if this makes sense, any points of confusion, things that you also might think could strengthen this proposal, I think it's an excellent, it's an important topic, it's an important area. I'd really like, I'm excited to see where this research goes. So let me turn back over to you for a few questions. I'm going to get a sip of water here. Samantha, I don't know if you're actually on and watching with us at the moment, because I know we're on different time zones. One of the great features of having students from all across the world. I'm just checking the stream. Okay, 2 seconds. Just checking the stream. Yep, looks good. Okay, guys, so I'm going to leave this here and take out this. I'm going to send this back to you, Samantha. Thanks again for sharing it with us. I think you're there, but I do think you've got a week of work. I think you can clean this up. I think you've got the content there, but it looks to me that you just started writing a lot without having that original clarity about the gap and your idea, and then being able to connect that idea to how you're going to test it in the data. So this is very common. This is a really common thing, and it's not easy to do, especially if you're doing this for the first time. So one thing that I think will be important to you as well is by getting this right, it's going to make the researcher, it's kind of your plan. Once you have this right, you'll be be able to go forward and then execute this in your research. So make sure all that's there. Guys, so I also want to bring up something else that I think is important that's come out of this is really engaging effectively your co-authors. It's something that a lot of students really struggle with. Know, okay, what expertise do I tap my co-authors? When do I bring them in? How can I get the best help from them? And I think this one, it looks like you've got some support from co-authors. I think I would make sure that's really important support to have your supervisors on board early. I would make sure that gap and the idea that you've talked to them about, hey, here's where I see a gap in the literature, and here's how I want to address it. I would make sure you've talked with them about those four elements of the gift model. Make sure that they're on board with, yep, I agree, that's a big gap. That's a good area of debate. That's something you want to plug into. I like your idea on target. I think that's going to make a contribution. I think it's going to be publishable. Feasibility, yeah, these data can work. You can do it. I believe you can do it with what you've got. And the timeline, yeah, you can do it within the scope of your PhD, and it can be part of your PhD. Those are conversations you need to have with your supervisor. So, sometimes I have students come to me and they're just all over the place. And I'm like, well, here, you've got to go back and get this model right. Then come to me, and then we can evaluate together if you got a winning idea or not in your field. If you got something that I always want to make sure that one of the first things I look for is I want to make sure it can be published. And convincing me that it can be published, you've got to get all four of those elements right. And wherever you go, your supervisor is probably going to want to see that you've got a research plan that's going to contribute to the field, because that's the goal of your PhD. You're contributing, you're pushing the frontiers of your field to the next level, and doing work that people in the field can look at and say, yeah, this person, here's Samantha, you've contributed to our field, you've made an advance, you've contributed to knowledge to help our field grow. That's the threshold you've got to pass. So, yeah, it looks like, Samantha, I haven't been able to see you join, so I know you're going to be watching on the replay. But again, a big thanks for sending this to us, because I know it's hard to put yourself out there and be critiqued live in this way, but I hope you see I'm doing it in a fierce but also loving and supportive, friendly way. That's what people in the group always tell me, that I'm fierce but loving, and that they're grateful for that, because they know they can trust me. They know it's also a safe space, that I have only their best interests at heart, and I have your best interests at heart, because I think this is a great research project. If you can execute on it, it's really addressing an important topic. It's just a little bit, again, of getting that framing right. So, guys, I think this is a good place to stop for today. I know we went a little bit deep, but I wanted to reiterate the gift method for you. And I see Abubakar and several others in the group. Again, I'm not sure if you had any questions, but I hope that was all clear to you guys today. And I'll leave it to you. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will look forward to seeing you next week, same place, same time, for our usual Grad Clinic. Again, submissions in advance. It's always better. I like to look live with you, but it's always better if you can give me a little more lead time so I can sift through them and pick some of the best ones to share with the group. All right, everybody. I'll see you all next week.